So this is the roadmap for today's discussion of the case at hand. The ordinary approach or the ordinary take on Brown, as I mentioned, is that it constitutes not only the most salient case of the so-called Gilded Age of American jurisprudence, this period between 1954 and 1969, the Warren Court, but also it represents a change of constitutional regime, according to Bruce Ackerman's theory of constitutional moments. So it introduced at the center not only of the moral discourse, but also of the American social and political process, the conception of racial equality, dismantling not only the system of Jim Crow, but also until 1954, the validated constitutional premise of the doctrine of separate but equal. Notwithstanding those truisms, today I would like us to explore what I would like to describe as the unconventional scholarly approaches towards Brown. In the conventional narrative that I just described, we find Brown as this landmark decision that was followed a decade later by the so-called landmark statutes. But there are some readings of Brown in a more contemporary fashion that put this decision not only in perspective, but also it analyzes or assesses Brown from a critical standpoint. So one thing as a methodology that I wanted to share with you today, not only for Brown, but for the remaining cases that we will discuss in our seminar, but also as a professional caveat that I wanted to share with you, is that it is always wise to assume different observational standpoints in order to acquire different perspectives. That is precisely what I expect us to do today, to assume an unconventional or different perspective towards the traditional assumption that Brown dismantled the doctrine of separate but equal and all the progeny of cases that followed Plessy, but that it also had a few downsides that we have to deal with, because Brown, notwithstanding its repercussion not only in American social and political life, not to mention American jurisprudence, the point of Brown is that from the view of Ackerman and Dworkin, both very authoritative voices of legal academia in the United States and even worldwide, both have serious concerns about how Brown was decided and how Brown was implemented afterwards in different spheres using Ackerman's grammar, in different spheres of social life. I would like to say that I think where I identified two basic contentions in Ackerman's chapter 7, the spheres of humiliation. One is the impact or the scope of Brown. There is a substantive criticism from Ackerman on the way Brown was predicated. And I would like to discover with you, in Ackerman's view, what was the efficient predicate of the decision in Brown afterwards. Contention number one. And the second contention is his idea, following Hannah Arendt's methodology, the way in which he treats the concept of humiliation and the way in which he upgrades to the concept of institutionalized humiliation. Actually, until the New Deal as a third constitutional moment in American history, the connection between law and other disciplines was considered unnecessary. Law was deemed as an autonomous discipline, an autonomous set not only of knowledge, but of also practical wisdom, and therefore it was actually seen as undermining law by trying to connect it or interrelate it with other academic disciplines. Therefore, the change in what Ackerman in other places has called as government by numbers led to the necessity of law to imbue its own operational code with other disciplines, particularly social sciences. And that gained currency after the New Deal, let's say the 1930s. In 1954, let's say that the so-called sociological jurisprudence had acquired some credit, but at that moment it wasn't embedded not only in the Supreme Court, but also in the legal profession. It was, let's say, a new trend of how to interconnect with other disciplines. The connection between constitutional adjudication as a democratic expression of the rule of law on the one hand, and consequently the role of a judge in a democracy, of a constitutional judge in a democracy, and this particular view of legal elites to predicate their decisions in a kind of inaccessible language because they relate the technicality and the specificity of that language with a senior view of constitutional adjudication. The more technical an opinion is, the more rational and adequate and fair will be that decision. So we will see, for example, how this conundrum of the technicality in terms and the lack of plain language in decisions comes to the fore in the way Chief Justice Warren Burger drafted the opinion on U.S. v. Nixon, and it was rejected by all his peers because they considered that it was not substantially articulated in legal terms. So this is a constant debate in terms of constitutional adjudication. As much as Ackerman outlines his argument based not on the anti-classification feature, Dworkin from the very beginning disregards the anti-classification argument, and he deals much more with banned sources or banned categories. The way in which the executive branch engages in conversations with either Congress or the court, depending on the constitutional moment that it's facing, that is precisely constitutional politics in motion. And that is the way in which Ackerman built the idea of the legitimacy of constitutional moments by endowing the outcome of authoritative signal because it was a result from this bitter conversation between these different branches of government that each one of them claims that they are a more legitimate spokesperson of we the people. So in this case, we find a more strategical approach from the court. I can assume that it was not in Warren's mind that in 10 years from Brown, there will be the landmark statutes from the Johnson administration. Because if you take a look at the end of Brown, their reliance was based solely on the wisdom of local judges to implement, and I quote, all deliberate speed, the decision in Brown to dismantle the Jim Crow system. So it was mainly based on the trust of judicial decision making to make good the decision in Brown. Afterwards, we found that the actual predicate of the 1954 decision was precisely the landmark statutes of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Housing Rights Act. Altogether, they constitute, in Ackerman's words, the new version of the constitutional canon or the civil rights canon. From Ackerman's view, it is inconceivable that Brown could have been adequately implemented if not assisted by the landmark statutes of a decade after. And then a great paragraph that I frequently quote is that one that starts with, in short, Brown not only represents the unanimous judgment of the Supreme Court at a great moment in its history, it also expresses the animating logic for the landmark statutes, which I just mentioned, supported by the American people at one of the greatest moments in their history. Given all this, isn't it past time for the legal community to reclaim Brown's lost logic? That is precisely also at the very center of Ackerman's work over the last 4 decades. His continuous criticism against the legal profession's conventional approach. that considers not only law as an autonomous discipline, but also that it is exclusively based on judicial decisions. Remember that Ackerman says that equally important to judicial decisions are the speeches from the presidents of the United States, from congressmen and lawmakers and civil rights leaders outlining the reality of the Negro.